SQL or NoSQL? Which database to use for my new system? Hey everyone, I am Gaurav and welcome to my channel Code with GD. In this video, I will tell you about SQL and NoSQL databases, and I will give you pointers on when to use SQL database and when to use a NoSQL database, and I will also give you examples on when you should use which type of database. So by the end of the video, you will have enough information to help you make an informed decision on which database to use for your upcoming project. So let's dive right in. First, I will tell you about SQL database. The data structure used in a SQL database is comprised of tables. For example, if I had to store employee information and the employee address, I would do it like this. I will create an employee table with all the employee information like employee ID, the name, maybe the employee's team, and I will create another table called address table. My address table will contain something called address ID, then the country, and maybe PIN code. I can also have city. Now this employee table will have a reference of this address table stored here. All the tables in SQL will have something called a primary key which will be unique to that table. For example, here employee ID is unique to this employees table and address ID is unique to this address table. Now this address ID here is a foreign key because this refers to a foreign table, and this address table will contain some addresses like address ID 1 will have maybe a country India, city can be Bangalore, and PIN can be something like 247. Now this address ID will be the same here. So we know that a person named Gaurav has an address stored at this position, which is address ID 1. Then we look up the address table and we search for the address ID 1 and we get the address details of this particular employee. Now each table in SQL is called schema, and since we have multiple tables in SQL, we also call it relational database. If I had to store the same information in NoSQL type database, I would do it something like this. So I have an employee table, and all data in a NoSQL database is stored in the form of documents. By documents, you can think of something like a JSON object, and it will have fields like employee ID, then name, and then team, and in place of address ID, I can store the entire address here. I don't need to reference it to a different document, so I can store address details like country, city, and PIN. So this is my NoSQL database. Now talking about differences, think about a case where different countries have different attributes for storing their address. For example, in India we have a concept of PIN codes, but in countries like US we have a concept of zip codes. So this means if a person stays in the US, now city is common to both India and US, so we could use the same attribute city. Let's say it is Chicago, but the PIN code for US will be null since US doesn't have PIN code. But we also want to store zip codes for the people residing in US. For that we will add a new column called zip code in my address table, and this person staying in US can have that value, but the zip will be null for a person staying in India. So now you can see that how unflexible this design is, because I didn't want zip for India, but I still have to maintain that record as a null state. Whereas if I use NoSQL to store the address, I would do it something like this. Talking specifically about this, I could have changed it to something like country US, my city is Chicago, and my zip is 140. I don't need to store PIN in NoSQL. So schemas in NoSQL are very flexible and they can change based on the user requirement or the feature requirement. So if you are unsure about what type of data you need to store, you should definitely go for NoSQL. Let's note it down. Whereas NoSQL is flexible. This is with respect to schema. What this also means is the schema in SQL is fixed. So when you are building your application on top of a SQL database, you know exactly what type of data you need. Whereas in NoSQL, there has to be some kind of logic in your application layer to parse the NoSQL data. So this is not fixed. At least the database doesn't restrict on what type of schema it should be. Another important point is consistency and availability. Now SQL guarantees some kind of ACID properties. What this means is if multiple people are performing operation on any data, it will guarantee that the data will be consistent. There are no race conditions. So SQL is more consistent with the data, which also means it will be less available. Now NoSQL on the other hand does not guarantee consistency, but it is highly available. So if your application is something that doesn't care so much about consistency, but it wants to be highly available, you should go for NoSQL database. Most of the banking applications, since they need to maintain consistency in money transactions, they choose SQL database to manage their wealth transactions. In the SQL database, we have multiple tables and there is relation between two tables, and they can be connected with something known as joins. If you had to insert some employee data in this SQL table, you would have to insert it in the employees table and then go and insert it in the address table. Assume you need to fetch some employee information. You need to search in the employees table, fetch that information, then look at the address ID and fetch the address for that address ID from the address table. So you had to query both the tables to fetch all the employee information, and joins is a costly operation. So retrievals and insertions are costly in a SQL database, whereas in a NoSQL database, we are storing all the data in one big object, and if we want to insert data, all of this will be inserted together, and if I want to query data, I will get all of this data in just one query. So I had to query once, whereas in this I had to query two tables to get the same data. Insertions and retrievals are faster in NoSQL. Imagine you had to filter all the employees belonging to a certain city. Now if you had to do this in SQL, you can directly come to the address table and look at the city column, and you can then filter addresses by the city and then use those address IDs to figure out which employees live in that city. If you had to do the same thing in a NoSQL database, you would have iterated through each employee, gone to the address field and checked the city of that employee, and if it did not match with what you wanted, you will reject it. We had to do lookups for each of the table in a NoSQL, whereas in a SQL we had to do lookup for only the employee we cared about. So that is a benefit of having joins or relation in a SQL table. This means filtering is faster in a SQL table, whereas here filtering is slower. Now SQL provides an implicit guarantee for foreign key concept. For example, this column can't have any value that doesn't exist in the address ID field. SQL provides an implicit guarantee for relational, whereas in NoSQL we don't have any such guarantee. We can have a different table, maybe a teams table here, and it can have different teams like dev. The application layer has to make sure that we stored value as dev here, and the teams table should have a value dev. Whereas if we did the same thing in a SQL, the database provides a guarantee that the team which has been entered is present. So my next point is, whereas a NoSQL provides no such guarantee. There is no one correct answer when it comes to choosing a SQL or a NoSQL database for your application. In system design, it's all about trade-offs. You could also choose to use a combination of both of MySQL and a NoSQL database. Most big companies use NoSQL database for only their analytics. They store all the analytics in one place in a NoSQL table, and NoSQL also provides built-in systems for aggregations like average age or total number of employees. So that way NoSQL is beneficial. For the parts of the system that require consistency, you can choose a SQL database. You could also base your decision on whether your system needs high availability. If that is the case, go for NoSQL. If consistency is more important to you, for example, you are building a financial application, go for a SQL database. If you know that the data structure and attributes you want to store in your database are going to change in future, or they are temporary, or your system needs it to be flexible, go for a NoSQL database. Whereas if you have clarity in what your data structure and attributes would look like, go for a SQL database. While designing a system, you need to weigh the pros and cons of using both SQL and NoSQL database, and both of them will have their own pros and cons. It depends on the type of system you are building, on what cons you are okay with and what pros are absolutely necessary. Based on that, you need to choose your database. And that's it for this video. If you enjoyed this video or learned something new, like this video and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel Code with GD. Till then, happy coding. Bye bye.